I solemnly swear that I am up to no good. Welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I am Alistair Stevens. This week, in our 55th session, we reach the duel in the graveyard of Little Hangleton, and the first real contest of strength and of skill and, of course, of older, greater magic between Harry and Voldemort. Tonight, the rest of Chapter 33, The Death Eaters, and Chapter 34, Priori Incantatum, for those of you keeping track at home, and I know that the published schedule for Dear Mr. Potter is now woefully out of date. We are going to spend 2 more sessions on the novel of Goblet of Fire. 2 more sessions after tonight, I should say. Next week, we're going to look at the following, we're going to look at Veritaserum and the Parting of the Ways, I guess, and then the last week, we're going to look at the beginning, and then wrap up the book with some general Q&A discussion, I'm sure. A lot to discuss, though, to make it through tonight. Let's get started with Chapter 33, The Death Eaters, picking up on where we ended our discussion last time. Let's talk about Wormtail's reward, shall we?
"Get up, Avery," said Voldemort softly. "Stand up. You ask for forgiveness. I do not forgive. I do not forget. 13 long years. I want 13 years repayment before I forgive you. Wormtail here has paid some of his debt already, have you not, Wormtail?" He looked down at Wormtail, who continued to sob. "You returned to me not out of loyalty, but out of fear of your old friends. You deserve this pain, Wormtail. You know that, don't you?"
"Yes, Master," moaned Wormtail. "Please, Master, please."
"Yet you helped return me to my body," said Voldemort coolly,
watching Wormtail sob on the ground.
"Worthless and traitorous as you are, you helped me, and Lord Voldemort rewards his helpers."
Voldemort raised his wand again and whirled it through the air. A streak of what looked like molten silver hung shining in the wand's wake. Momentarily shapeless, it writhed and then formed itself into a gleaming replica of a human hand, bright as moonlight, which soared downward and fixed itself upon Wormtail's bleeding wrist. Wormtail's sobbing stopped abruptly. His breathing harsh and ragged, he raised his head and stared in disbelief at the silver hand, now attached seamlessly to his arm as though he were wearing a dazzling glove. He flexed the shining fingers, then, trembling, picked up a small twig on the ground and crushed it into powder.
"My lord," he whispered. "Master, it is beautiful. Thank you, thank you."
He scrambled forward on his knees and kissed the hem of Voldemort's robes.
"May your loyalty never waver again, Wormtail," said Voldemort.
The function of Voldemort as the focal point of all dark wizardry, in effect, the function of Voldemort as the figurehead of the Death Eaters, as distinct from Voldemort's singular tyranny, right? As distinct from Voldemort's role as the villain of the piece, the greatest villain ever to face the wizarding world. His role within the context of the Death Eaters is that of a traditional tyrant, in fact. He rules through fear and domination, but he also rewards. When he rewards capriciously, but he rewards nonetheless, because that's the carrot to the ever-present stick of serving Voldemort, I suppose. He has to, for this population of people in particular who are so preoccupied with power, personal power, their own power, and the domination of others, and the tangible rewards of service to dark magic, he has to offer them, yes, fear to keep them in line, fear to instill within them a focused and driving, a motivating loyalty, but he also has to offer them the promise of reward. And the great thing about being Voldemort is that you don't actually have to reward that often. You don't actually have to give anyone anything, because the promise of reward is so great that these people in particular will jump through pretty much any hoop that you establish. Avery, we should note here, because we're going to talk a lot about the Death Eaters in tonight's session. Avery was introduced to us earlier in Sirius's discussion of the Death Eaters, when we're told that he claimed that he was acting under the Imperious Curse and was then exonerated, was then let go. He begs forgiveness here from Voldemort right before the session, and is rewarded instead with the Cruciatus Curse, which seems to be Voldemort's go-to punishment for anyone who wrongs him or stands in his way. We're going to see a lot more of the Cruciatus Curse as we move through the following chapter. We're going to talk, as I said, more about the Death Eaters, but this opposition is vital to understanding how Voldemort rules this group of individually powerful and individually ambitious people. His domination is absolute. He is cruel and merciless and capricious, which means that there is no space for ambiguity. There is no space for a potential misreading of one's loyalty to Voldemort, right? If you are a Death Eater and you are not absolutely loyal, then the Cruciatus Curse is heading your way. At the very best, the Cruciatus Curse is heading your way. Here we see the manifestation of that, and also the reward for Wormtail, the giving to Wormtail of this silver hand. And again, I'm struck by the use of silver here from J.K. Rowling, because silver has so often, almost universally, in fact, prior to this part of this book, silver has almost always been associated with positive things, right? If you think about the silvery things that we have seen of late, the Expecto Patronum charm and the consequences of the Expecto Patronum charm, the Patronuses themselves, of course, and also the fluidic memories of Dumbledore contained within the Pensieve. Those are the two most recent examples of silvery light, but silvery light is generally always good. Silver is generally always good within the frame of Harry Potter, and here it is being subverted. And in so doing, we are establishing Voldemort's mastery over all magic. It's not just evil magic. It's not just that he is going to succumb to the temptation to cast dark spells, to wield dark wizardry and kind of lean into that Tolkienian Sauron kind of corruption that flows forth from evil. He can do anything. As I mentioned last time, he is a bad wizard. He is a dark wizard, yes, but he is also a great wizard, and those two things are distinct. He is exceptionally skilled and also exceptionally evil, and there is obviously a functional, compelling, a tyrannical overlap between those two things, but there's not a complete systematic cohesion between those two parts of Voldemort's character. He is exceptionally skilled and also exceptionally dangerous. It is no surprise, of course, that this is one of the more sophisticated applications of magic that we have seen in the Harry Potter series to date. The most obvious contrast, of course, is Mad-Eye Moody's magical eye. Mad-Eye Moody's magical eye is a product of artifice. It is wrought with cunning, but it is not seamless. It is not magical in the way that Wormtail's hand here is magical, and that opposition speaks to Voldemort's power there. Yeah, as Angela observes here, it's the twisting and distortion of a good magical symbol. I completely agree. Oh, and Becca's pointing out, but it moves, so it's like Mercury, so it's bad. Not a bad bit of deductive reasoning there, actually, Becca. Right. I can see where you're going with that. Yes. And Sarah saying, so the silver hand would be an extension of Voldemort's mind and thought. Yeah, and Becca also calling out Fleur's hair. Oh, Sarah, I'm sorry. So the first thought that Sarah offered was silver equals thought, so the silver hand would be an extension of Voldemort's mind and thought. Yes, that's certainly my reading of it. I think that it is not a piece of transfiguration, I suppose. It's not the kind of magic that Minerva McGonagall would teach. It doesn't seem to have the same indicators that we would associate with transfigurative magic. This does seem to be a conscious manifestation of Voldemort's will. I think that reading that as a representation of his thought, reading the silver color of the hand as a manifestation of his thought, is actually a very astute bit of reading, Sarah. Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. But of course, thought itself, generally regarded as a good thing, right? We go bad in Harry Potter. We take the wrong path in Harry Potter when we cease to think. More on that as Harry wrestles once again with the Imperio Curse in just a few pages' time. Let's get into the depth here with the Death Eaters.
The Lestranges should stand here, said Voldemort quietly, but they are entombed in Azkaban. They were faithful. They went to Azkaban rather than renounce me. When Azkaban is broken open, the Lestranges will be honored beyond their dreams. The Dementors will join us. They are our natural allies. We will recall the banished giants. I shall have all my devoted servants return to me, and an army of creatures whom all fear.
He walked on. Some of the Death Eaters he passed in silence, but he paused before others and spoke to them.
McNair, destroying dangerous beasts for the Ministry of Magic now, Wormtail tells me. You shall have better victims than that soon, McNair. Lord Voldemort will provide.
Thank you, Master. Thank you, murmured McNair.
And here,
Voldemort moved on to the two largest hooded figures.
We have Crabbe. You will do better this time, will you not, Crabbe? And you, Goyle?
They bowed clumsily, muttering dully.
Yes, Master, we will, Master. The same goes for you, not,
said Voldemort quietly as he walked past a stooped figure in Mr. Goyle's shadow.
My lord, I prostrate myself before you. I am your most faithful. That will do, said Voldemort.
He had reached the largest gap of all, and he stood surveying it with his blank red eyes, as though he could see people standing there. As Harry will note later, as Harry will note within the pages of the next chapter, in fact, there are at least 30 Death Eaters gathered here, which I have to tell you, reading this chapter feels like a lot. It feels like an almost excessive number, but it is indicative of the depth of Voldemort's following, I suppose, of the depth of his authority, the depth of his rule, even now, so long after his fall and his apparent destruction, his apparent death. We will get 7 named here. Lucius Malfoy, of course, Walden McNair, who we'll talk about in just a moment, Avery, who was aforementioned, Crabbe and Goyle, Nott, and of course Wormtail Peter Pettigrew. We get a reference to the Lestranges, who were introduced in Sirius's first account of the Death Eaters back in the cave on the outskirts of Hogsmeade. McNair is the executioner who was sent to kill Buckbeak in the pages of Prisoner of Azkaban. This is absolutely definitively the same character, same name, and obviously the reference that we get here, destroying dangerous beasts for the Ministry of Magic now, Wormtail tells me, which means that working for the Ministry itself, to kind of fold back our discussion on our discussion from last week, in which Voldemort offered this theoretical explanation of the betrayal of some of the Death Eaters, that they had apprehended a greater power in the world, the defender of muggles and mudbloods and common folk, Albus Dumbledore. Remember when he laid that all out? Oh, is that why so many have betrayed me? Is that why so many have abandoned my cause? Because they have instead, like moths to a flame, been drawn to the power of Albus Dumbledore? Well, we talked last time about Dumbledore's role as an exemplar of wizarding society, of the good wizard, capital G, capital W, and the degree to which that is what sticks in Voldemort's craw, versus the notion of the Ministry itself, and whether or not we consider wizarding society to be a good thing. Well, it turns out that we have canonical evidence that working for the Ministry does not in any way redeem a Death Eater, or in any way challenge that Death Eater's loyalty to Voldemort. The idea that there are Death Eaters still active within the Ministry is, of course, no great surprise. Not all of the Death Eaters were rounded up after the First Wizarding War. There are still some out there. But the fact that there are still some out there, and Voldemort sees no incompatibility whatsoever between working for the Ministry and still continuing to serve him, is a really interesting beat. It casts a shadow over the Ministry. This is one of those moments where, as an informed and careful reader, we pause and think, well, wait, is the Ministry just not good then? And of course, by this point in Goblet of Fire, I think we've had a pretty large amount of evidence suggesting that the Ministry of Magic is not entirely good. Crabbe and Goyle, of course, presumably the fathers of Crabbe and Goyle. They're not gendered here, but presumably they are the fathers because they are the largest hooded figures. We have Crabbe, you will do better this time, will you not, Crabbe? And you, Goyle, obviously the fathers of Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle, Draco Malfoy's cohorts. Voldemort will then note 6 missing Death Eaters. That's the largest gap of all in the circle that has assembled around him, which does strongly suggest that there is in fact assigned seating in the meetings of the Death Eaters as they gather in this circle around Voldemort. You are supposed to stand in a particular place. There are 6 missing Death Eaters. 3 are dead, we are told. 1 too cowardly to return, 1 who is gone for good and will be punished, and 1 who is still a faithful servant and is pursuing Voldemort's agenda at Hogwarts. The identity of the 3 are really interesting, actually, particularly because we have 3 potential bearers of the Dark Mark already present at Hogwarts. Now, of course, we're going to get a pretty major reveal in next week's reading that is going to invert our understanding of much of the action of this story. The Alistair Moody subplot is going to be brought to an abrupt close in next week's reading. But right now, without an awareness of that at all, right now we have 3 potential Dark Mark suspects. We have Igor Karkaroff, of course. We have Severus Snape. And we have, most interestingly, Ludo Bagman. Ludo Bagman was not, by all accounts, a Death Eater. When Crouch lays out the charges against Bagman, he says that he had been indicted only for passing information to Voldemort's supporters, not necessarily for being a Death Eater himself. This is the accounting that we get when Harry is experiencing Dumbledore's memories via the pensive, of course. But when that happens, and when that reveal comes, Harry's internal monologue breaks into the prose to say, Ludo Bagman, comma, a Death Eater, question mark? That rhetorical association between Ludo Bagman and the Death Eaters as a massed rank is a really interesting and compelling one. And I think that the reveal that there are 3 still operational at 3 Death Eaters, if not operational, still present at Hogwarts is an interesting one. is one of these very satisfying pieces of mystery building that we get throughout Goblet of Fire, where in the aftermath of the revelation, we can look at this and say, oh, of course, it was obvious, it was laid out for us. But in the present of the story too, it also works. It casts a deeper shadow over Bagman. He is at the very least the most obvious suspect for this third Death Eater slot, specifically for the loyal Death Eater who is still working at Hogwarts, still pursuing Voldemort's agenda. So 3 are dead. We should talk about the 3 that are dead, I suppose. 2 are presumably Rosier and Wilkes. These are mentioned by Sirius earlier in that scene in the cave where he kind of gives us the rundown of the Death Eaters. And the 3rd is probably, I mean, we can't be completely certain because this is the largest gap in the circle of Death Eaters, but by no means the only gap. So we can't be sure that this is the case, but there's a decent chance that the 3rd dead Death Eater in this scene is Regulus Black, who will not be introduced to us until the next book. But for those of you who have read the entire series, it might be him. It might be him. Rosier and Wilkes were, of course, killed by Aurors, according to Sirius's account back in the cave on the outskirts of Hogsmeade. So 3 are dead, 1 is too cowardly to return, 1 is gone for good and will be punished, 1 is still a faithful servant. The one who is too cowardly to return is almost certainly Igor Karkaroff, right? There is a certain amount of speculation about which is which. Is the coward Igor Karkaroff, or is the one who is gone for good, is the one who has betrayed Voldemort's cause and will therefore be punished Igor Karkaroff? My reading is that the coward is Igor Karkaroff and the one who is gone for good and will therefore be punished is Severus Snape. And then the 3rd is the mystery, but everything about the plot as we understand it right now, particularly that memory of Ludo Bagman and Harry's interjection, Harry's internal interjection in that sequence, does suggest that Ludo Bagman may be the 3rd Death Eater. Of course, that will turn out to not be the case. Not is also introduced here for the first time. The same goes for you, Not, said Voldemort quietly as he walked past a stooped figure in Mr. Goyle's shadow. My lord, I prostrate myself before you. I am your most faithful. That will do, said Voldemort. And indeed that will, because that's pretty much all that we get of Not. This is the first mention of him. Yeah, not a terribly significant figure. Yeah. Jacob says coward would be good for Snape and gone for good is Igor. Completely legitimate, right? That is a completely legitimate reading. I'm biased, and of course we'll be able to deconstruct this when we have the post-show aftermath discussion with Dumbledore in next week's reading, but I am inclined toward the cowardly Igor Karkaroff. I'm thinking in particular of the scene in the potions classroom when Karkaroff goes to Snape and is clearly panicking about the reemergence, what we now know to be the reemergence of the dark mark on his arm. He seems to be less settled and less comfortable. And of course, well, again, Igor Karkaroff definitely betrayed the Death Eaters, right? He definitely gave names to Bartemius Crouch during the whole Inquisition that came after the First Wizarding War. So it is a little ambiguous there. But yes, cowardly could apply to Severus Snape. Cowardly could apply to Igor Karkaroff. You know, the one who is gone for good and will therefore be punished could also apply to either of them. We'll kind of break that down as we move forward too. Yeah. Rohit says, whatever Voldemort thinks of Snape at this point, I don't think he judged the man as cowardly. That descriptor is much better for Karkaroff. I think I lean toward that, though I could also see Voldemort reading Snape's I don't want to go too far down this road and start giving an account of Snape's actions, particularly because the book has very directly dodged that question at this point. Remember, at the end of the pensive chapter, when Harry is asking about Snape, Dumbledore says, no, I know, and that's enough for now. I don't need to tell you what is going on with Severus Snape. I know, I trust him, that's enough. So the book is clearly resisting our analytical urges in that regard. So I don't want to jump the track here and start talking about what actually happened with Severus Snape in the wake of the First Wizarding War, why he became apparently a spy for the good guys, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about that when we get to it, because goodness knows we'll have plenty of time to talk about it when we get to it. Yeah. Marshall is saying here, Karkaroff is always such an enigma to me. All the other Death Eaters are British, but Karkaroff is vaguely Eastern European and marked with an appropriate and appropriately vague accent, yet he's still subject to the British ministry's laws, even though he clearly flees to Durmstrang after the trial. Yeah. I don't really know what we can do with that. I genuinely don't. It is clearly intended to be the case that Voldemort's rise to power was a global or pseudo-global phenomenon. That is my read of what we are supposed to take of this right now. But it is also focused very much on Britain. It is Voldemort versus the Ministry. All of the primary events of the First Wizarding War take place within the bounds of the United Kingdom. Thus, Igor Karkaroff's presence there is a bit of an outlier. It is one of the beats that makes us question the whole notion of bringing in Durmstrang and Beauxbaton into the Triwizard Tournament context, right? This idea of extending hands of friendship across Europe to the other largest wizarding schools on the continent. That's a powerful idea, and it plays into, as we've talked about before, this notion of French or pseudo-French romanticism and kind of Slavic or pseudo-Slavic austerity, right? We've discussed that when we had the Beauxbaton and Durmstrang delegations arriving at Hogwarts, which feels like a million years ago. But yes, Karkaroff is an odd one. He is allied and aligned with Voldemort, but again, we just don't know. Is being a Death Eater sufficient to get you hurled into Azkaban? Is that it? If you self-identify as a Death Eater and do nothing wrong, if you self-identify as a Death Eater and you have the Dark Mark, but you don't actually commit any crimes, is that enough to get you thrown into Azkaban? Well, clearly yes, but only by the time that we get to Barty Crouch's Inquisition in the wake of the First Wizarding War. Prior to that, and even in the years after that, it is a little more ambiguous. Did Igor Karkaroff break specific laws governing British wizards within the frame of the United Kingdom? I mean, presumably, yes, but we don't have enough understanding about how the judicial system works in the wizarding world. Luckily, we're going to get a lot more on that later. Let's continue moving on here as I catch up with the chat. Boy, you guys are chatty tonight. Look at that. Yeah. Okay, let's catch up here and move ever onward to find out what happened to Harry.
You know, of course, that they have called this boy my downfall,
Voldemort said softly, his red eyes upon Harry, whose scar began to burn so fiercely that he almost screamed in agony.
You all know that on the night I lost my powers and my body, I tried to kill him. His mother died in the attempt to save him and unwittingly provided him with a protection I admit I had not foreseen. I could not touch the boy.
Voldemort raised one of his long white fingers and put it very close to Harry's cheek.
His mother left upon him the traces of her sacrifice. This is old magic. I should have remembered it. I was foolish to overlook it. But no matter. I can touch him now.
Harry felt the cold tip of the long white finger touch him and thought his head would burst with the pain. Voldemort laughed softly in his ear, then took the finger away and continued addressing the Death Eaters.
I miscalculated, my friends. I admit it. My curse was deflected by the woman's foolish sacrifice, and it rebounded upon myself. Ah, pain beyond pain, my friends. Nothing could have prepared me for it. I was ripped from my body. I was less than spirit, less than the meanest ghost, but still I was alive. What I was, even I do not know. I, who have gone further than anybody along the path that leads to immortality. You know my goal. To conquer death. And now I was tested, and it appeared that one or more of my experiments had worked, for I had not been killed, though the curse should have done it. Nevertheless, I was as powerless as the weakest creature alive, and without the means to help myself, for I had no body, and every spell that might have helped me required the use of a wand. I remember only forcing myself, sleeplessly, endlessly, second by second, to exist. I settled in a faraway place, in a forest, and I waited. Surely one of my faithful Death Eaters would try to find me. One of them would come and perform the magic I could not, to restore me to a body, but I waited in vain.
Becca saying in the chat, I can touch him now. No, you can't, Voldy. I want Molly to show up and kick his butt. Hey, we always want Molly to show up and kick Voldemort's butt. And pretty much all bad guys, actually. Yeah. Molly Weasley as a Deus Ex Machina at the end here, as a eucatastrophic appearance here at the end of the story. I wouldn't hate that, honestly. I might shake my head a little bit at the structuralism of it all, but I don't hate it emotionally. I don't hate it as raw narrative, certainly. So this is the best and cleanest account that we have had so far of what happened on that fateful night when Harry became, for once and for all, the boy who lived. You know, of course, that they've called this boy my downfall. You all know on that night, on the night I lost my powers in my body, I tried to kill him. So again, Voldemort is leaning into the narrative of Harry Potter, right? Harry Potter's the boy who defeated Voldemort. He withstood the curse and defeated Voldemort. That's amazing. Now we've already... I was going to say cast a shadow, but I don't think we've quite cast a shadow as held that idea up to the light and scrutinized it a little bit thanks to Dumbledore. You'll remember that discussion, right? It's not that Harry is the boy who lived, it's that Voldemort cast the curse that failed. You all know that on the night I lost my powers and my body, the the inverse equivalence there is really interesting. I lost my powers. Oh, and also tangentially my body, which really sucked. But my powers, though. His mother died in the attempt to save him and unwittingly provided him with a protection I admit I had not foreseen. I could not touch the boy. Well, that's it. It is the sacrifice of Lily Potter that saved young Harry. Lily bestows a magical protection, and we can talk about this a little bit because we're not really going to get a clean perspective on this in the course of the books. A lot of this information comes from interviews and accounts given after the fact by J.K. Rowling, and I'm normally loath to delve into extra textual material, but in this case she offers some further exploration and exposition upon this topic, which is pretty clear in the book if you break down exactly what happened. But this idea, this is old magic, I should have remembered it, I was foolish to overlook it, this is sacrificial protection. This is the sacrificial charm. Lily chooses to die. And in the choice to die, she manifests a great protective power. This is, as I mentioned last week, the second reference that we get to old magic. The ritual to resurrect Voldemort, to re-embody Voldemort, is described as old dark magic, and this is also old magic. It is not, and we have to be very careful about this, it is not a spell. It is not wizarding as we know it in the wizarding world. And we've talked about this before too, right? The breaking points between our understanding of magic as they are represented at Hogwarts and the kinds of magic that we see made manifest throughout the rest of what we, with increasing kind of imperial domination, call the wizarding world. Elves have different kinds of magic. Centaurs have different kinds of magic. Unicorns have different kinds of magic. Goblins have different kinds of magic. There is a lot of magic out there in the world that has nothing to do with the casting of spells and jinxes and charms and all the other things that we do at Hogwarts. The crafting of potions, for example. That is wizardly magic. The magic that we study at Hogwarts is wizardly, but it is clearly already not the only kind of magic in the world. But there is an older magic, a deeper magic, which is accessible to human beings, either accidentally or instinctively, might be a better word than accidentally, I suppose, in the form of Lily Potter's sacrifice to save Harry, or purposefully, deliberately, as Peter Pettigrew puts the ritual together to re-embody his boss and master. That old magic is represented beautifully in the sacrifice of Lily. The thing that we have to understand here, basically, in order to distinguish what happens, is that James is going to be killed. Harry's father is going to be killed no matter what. So his attempted sacrifice to protect his wife and child is actually meaningless because he is not at any point choosing death. Lily is going to be allowed to leave. Like, she has the choice to make. She could leave for reasons which we will explore much later in the series. She will be allowed to leave. She will be allowed to survive. But she chooses not to. And in that choice, she releases a huge potential, ancient and innate magic. This sacrificial charm, the sacrificial protection, as I say, clearly isn't a spell. There's no accounting of Lily casting a spell, of waving a wand, of speaking a word of power in this moment. This is something older and more pure. This is something that speaks to the very deepest level of philosophical opposition at the heart of Harry Potter, right? What do we do in Harry Potter? What distinguishes the good from the evil in Harry Potter? Well, it's in the broadest possible sense, cooperation and community, but it is also specifically sacrifice. We'll, again, have the opportunity to talk about this later in a very different context, but it's important, I think, at this point to understand exactly what happened here. So, Voldemort tries to kill Harry. You all know that on the night I lost my powers in my body, I tried to kill him, right? He is targeting Harry in this moment. His mother died in the attempt to save him and unwittingly provided him with a protection I admit I had not foreseen. I could not touch the boy. His mother left upon him the traces of her sacrifice. This is old magic. I should have remembered it. I was foolish to overlook it, but no matter. I can touch him now. I miscalculated, my friends, I admit it. My curse was deflected by the woman's foolish sacrifice, and it rebounded upon myself. He used Avada Kedavra. He used the killing curse that gives the title to tonight's session of Dear Mr. Potter, and it rebounded upon himself. He was killed by the killing curse. But that is not the end of his story. I was less than a spirit, less than the meanest ghost, but still I was alive. What I was, even I do not know. I who have gone further than anybody along the path that leads to immortality. You know my goal, to conquer death. By the way, hey, my Death Eaters, you know what I'm about, right? You know, like, number one on Voldemort's to-do list, conquer death, defeat death, eat death. Right, yes, this is why I am here. This is why we are pursuing this goal, to conquer it. Now I was tested, and it appeared that one or more of my experiments had worked, for I had not been killed though the curse should have done it. This acknowledgement that it was basically, well, if not luck, then at least a desperate kind of test here that saved Voldemort is really interesting. He acknowledges the curse should have worked. That should have been the end of my story, but something within me survived. Some fragment of me survived. I fled. I waited for a Death Eater to come and fix me up. Waited a while, though, turns out. Waited 13 years, in fact, before one of you guys came along and helped me out. But yeah, let me see here as I catch up with the chat. Oh, I'm scrolling back to find this comment from C-Star here. Yes, C-Star saying, how did Voldemort learn about love magic such that he should have remembered it? I like love magic, actually. That's pretty good. I wouldn't necessarily consider that to be the focal point of Voldemort's studies, but old magic is clearly very powerful. Lily's sacrificial charm does exactly what it... I was going to say does exactly what it was intended to do. Of course, it was not consciously intended, but it manifests a latent kind of goodness that is clearly a part of the world of Harry Potter. In the world of Harry Potter, an act of conscious and deliberate sacrifice can actually protect the person that you are trying to protect. It is a manifestation of love in much the same way as we can see the Expecto Patronum charm as being kind of a manifestation of love in the sense that love is entwined with and peripheral to hope, I suppose, right? We can see that love is a powerful force in the world of Harry Potter. It is a powerful narrative force, of course, but it is also a powerful magical force. But this oldest kind of magic is unconquerable, is magnificently powerful. We have already established pretty firmly that, as Harry is going to acknowledge, in fact, in the very next chapter, referencing the lesson that he was taught by Mad-Eye Moody, the killing curse is unblockable. There is nothing you can do to stop the killing curse when it is heading your way, except, by the way, there's definitely something that you can do. It takes an act of genuine love and genuine heroism to do it, but that suggests a fundamental bias in the wizarding world. Not the wizarding world, the world of Harry Potter, I suppose. Within this fictional creation, there is a fundamental bias toward goodness, or if not a fundamental bias, at least a fundamental power associated with love. This is one of the oldest and most powerful forces that there is. And I have no trouble believing that Voldemort would have studied them, or would at least have flipped through an old book in the restricted section of the Hogwarts library and then cast it aside, thinking, well, that's obviously never going to be relevant to me, right? That's never going to play into my plans for world domination. Yeah, good. Becca observing, narrativium is made of love that fixes all problems and fills all plot holes. Yes. Eve says, so I have to say, it surprises me that everyone is so blindsided by this. I'm stunned that Lily seems to be the first person in recorded history to do this. Well, okay, let's look at this. Look at the circumstances, right? It's clearly not, for reasons which will become apparent later, it's clearly not killing curse specific. The sacrificial protection is not a protection against Avada Kedavra specifically. It is a protection against dark magics. But in order for it to be made manifest, I suppose, in order for it to emerge, in order for it to occur, you have to sacrifice yourself out of free choice in the protection of someone that you love. And then someone has to be around to tell stories about it and write about it and understand it. I suppose that if Voldemort had died that night, then there would have been, a shrug. Who then could have given this account? Who then could have offered any greater understanding of what had actually happened? That fragment of Voldemort that survived, which will, of course, be so important later in the series, that the structure surrounding the fragment of Voldemort that survived, which is going to be so important later in the series, is also completely unprecedented. No one has gone as far down the path that leads to immortality as Voldemort, right? No one has taken these steps before. So yes, it is a very unusual set of circumstances. Eve, I think there may be stories in the wizarding world of times where things like this have happened, but the kind of scientific rigor that we bring to magic within the frame of Hogwarts, within the frame of the wizarding world, would lean against that idea of mythic magic, I suppose, or even of older magic. Magic, as we've said before, is something that can be pinned down and dissected and understood and replicated. Magic is less art than science, and it is certainly less, well, philosophy or cosmology or theology or metaphysics, which the older sacrificial protection seems to be. That does lean into this idea of fundamental constants in the universe and the power of love. Everyone now is hearing Huey Lewis in the news in their heads. All right, let's move on to Voldemort casting the Cruciatus Curse on Harry.
My father's bone, naturally, meant that we would have to come here where he was buried, but the blood of a foe, Wormtail, would have had me use any wizard. Would you not, Wormtail? Any wizard who hated me, as so many of them still do. But I knew the one I must use. If I was to rise again, more powerful than I had been when I had fallen, I wanted Harry Potter's blood. I wanted the blood of the one who had stripped me of power 13 years ago, for the lingering protection his mother once gave him would then reside in my veins, too. But how to get at Harry Potter? For he has been better protected than I think even he knows, protected in ways devised by Dumbledore long ago, when it fell to him to arrange the boy's future. Dumbledore invoked an ancient magic to ensure the boy's protection as long as he is in his relation's care. Not even I can touch him there. Then, of course, there was the Quidditch World Cup. I thought his protection might be weaker there, away from his relations and Dumbledore, but I was not yet strong enough to attempt kidnap in the midst of a horde of Ministry wizards. And then the boy would return to Hogwarts, where he is under the crooked nose of that muggle-loving fool from morning until night. So how could I take him? Why, by using Bertha Jorkins' information, of course. Use my one faithful Death Eater stationed at Hogwarts to ensure that the boy's name was entered into the Goblet of Fire. Use my Death Eater to ensure that the boy won the tournament, that he touched the Triwizard Cup first, the cup which my Death Eater had turned into a portkey, which would bring him here, beyond the reach of Dumbledore's help and protection, and into my waiting arms. And here he is, the boy you all believed had been my downfall.
Voldemort moved slowly forward and turned to face Harry. He raised his wand.
Crucio!
And so the plot is unfolded for us. Well, unfolded for us in part, obviously, the mystery of the faithful Death Eater at Hogwarts. We'll have to wait around a few pages more to get the final accounting of that particular subplot, but the core plot of the story here is pretty much transparent at this point. Voldemort has returned. He is planning the ritual to restore his body. He wants specifically the blood of Harry Potter. Dumbledore has tapped into ancient magic to protect Harry when he is with the Dursleys, and well, that's a rich avenue of speculation, isn't it? We can really get into that a little bit. I'm almost tempted not to. I'm almost tempted not to go down this road. Let's skim it for now. We'll kind of half put a pin in it, I suppose. It is possible that Dumbledore has tapped into ancient magic. This could be a third repetition of this idea of old magic, of primal magic, though it feels of a very different sort, I suppose, because it doesn't speak to a kind of primal motivation that either of the other examples of old magic do. The desire to be re-embodied, the desire to be restored to life and to vigor, to be restored to personhood and selfhood, well, that's pretty elemental to the human experience. The desire to sacrifice oneself in the love of another, that is also pretty elemental to human experience. The desire to abstractly protect someone in a particular environment and a particular milieu, well, that's a little more complicated, isn't it? I find myself wondering if the ancient magic that Dumbledore used to protect Harry when he is at the Dursleys' house is the Dursleys' house. I find myself wondering if part of the conflict between the Wizarding world and the Muggle world is limiting to the Wizarding world, I suppose. I'm really hesitating over quite how to frame this, and this is an imperfectly conceived thought at this point. This is something that I want to kind of delve more deeply into right when we get to the end of the book, probably in that last session when we touch on the last chapter of the book and do a little Q&A. I would like to talk about the developing relationships between the Wizarding world and the Muggle world, but at this point in the Harry Potter series, we kind of have to ask the question, why do wizards keep Muggles around? What is the benefit of the Muggle world? We have seen the Wizarding world turn from this hidden and sequestered community into the dominant political and social force in the British Isles, I suppose, through Prisoner of Azkaban, now into Goblet of Fire. The Wizarding world is not hiding from the Muggle world anymore. The Wizarding world is protecting the Muggle world from wizards. But why? Why is that the case? There are people who are incapable of performing magic contained within the wizarding world. There are squibs in the wizarding world. We know this to be true. We know that Argus Filch is one such, right? We know that there are people who are less talented with magic. We know that there are people who are incapable of casting spells, still kind of contained within or adjacent to the wizarding world. For all we know, I suppose, technically following the letter of the law, right? Hagrid, for example, should not be casting spells, and yet Hagrid is still innately magical. He is still innately a part of this world. Why does the Muggle world exist? Can it exist because it applies a negative pressure back against the wizarding world? Can it exist because there is something about the Muggle world, in exactly the same way as Hermione very conspicuously just give us this accounting of electronics and electricity failing when they come near a standing magical field, when they come near Hogwarts, right? This is why it's impossible for Rita Skeeter to have bugged Hogwarts using, electronic means, because technology fails when you get close to Hogwarts. Is the opposite also true? Is it true that magic falters and fails when you are in a completely Muggle environment? And the Dursleys, of course, as we've observed right from the beginning of the Harry Potter series, are the Mugglest Muggles. They really are. This is the most mean-spirited and close-minded and parochial family that we have met in the span of the Harry Potter series. Is the older magic of Muggle protection simply Muggle protection? Maybe. Maybe not. We'll have opportunities to discuss this again. Yeah. Vikati's saying, this issue makes me think about how flawed the wizarding world is. Even the greatest wizard of all time does not have it figured out. And if he doesn't, who does? This is all very good. Oh, this is great too. Spriha's asking, random question. What is going on back at Hogwarts while this is going on in the graveyard? Your guess is as good as mine. Panic? I'm going to guess panic. Things have gone ominously quiet in the middle of the labyrinth. No red sparks have come up into the air. It's just been quiet for a bit now. I guess that the crowd is on the edge of its seats, waiting for some reveal to come from the heart of the maze. Yes, and Marshall saying, if Voldy showed up at number 4, Vernon would scoff him to death. Like, yes, I'm wondering if that is a strong part of it. Anyway, then we get onto the Quidditch World Cup, the idea that Voldemort is aware of Harry's presence at the Quidditch World Cup, but is not yet empowered to take action against him, also separating Voldemort from the appearance of the dark mark in the sky over the over the Quidditch World Cup there too. And then he's going to come back to Hogwarts, where he's under the crooked nose of that Muggle-loving fool from morning until night. So how should I take him? Why? By using Bertha Jorkins' information, of course. What is Bertha Jorkins' information? Bertha Jorkins' information is there's going to be another Triwizard Tournament. We are resurrecting the venerable and occasionally fatal Triwizard Tournament this year at Hogwarts. This information is everything that Voldemort needs to put his plan into action. Use my one faithful Death Eater stationed at Hogwarts to ensure that the boy's name was entered into the Goblet of Fire. Okay, step 1, circumvent the protection around the goblet. Somehow circumvent the attribution of individual champions to individual schools, as we discussed at the time. Presumably, Harry was entered either under a 4th school or no school at all, which was why the goblet was capable of pulling his name out at all. So first, circumvent those protections and precautions and enter Harry's name into the Goblet of Fire. Then, use my Death Eater to ensure that the boy won the tournament, that he touched the Triwizard Cup first. So not only is it sufficient that Harry, 3 years younger than the other champions of the Triwizard Tournament, be entered into the tournament, he also has to win. He is also going to be manipulated behind the scenes to make sure that he wins. Again, by the way, parenthetically, all of this evidence very much supporting the implicit accusation against Ludo Bagman at this point in the story, right? But then he's going to touch the Triwizard Cup, the cup which my Death Eater had turned into a portkey, which would bring him here, beyond the reach of Dumbledore's help and protection, and into my waiting arms. And here he is, the boy you all believed had been my downfall. Ladies and gentlemen, Harry Potter and the Implausible Plot. If the Death Eater can transform an object into a portkey, and then have that portkey transport Harry to the graveyard here at Little Hangleton, why not make it a mug of pumpkin juice? Why not make it a mug of butterbeer? Why not make it Harry's broom, or, I don't know, literally any object that Harry interacts with on a daily basis? Why not enchant a piece of parchment into a portkey, fold it all up in an envelope, send it to Harry via owl, and when he opens it, boom, pow, kazam, he's there in the graveyard? Why go through all this orchestration with the Triwizard Tournament? And the answer is because we need a plot to get us through the rest of the book. We need a plot to get us to the turning point where the book is revealed to not be the book that you thought it was. Voldemort is playing into exactly that kind of wizardly theatricality that we discussed last time. He is the wizardiest wizard. He is absolutely the greatest wizard in multiple senses, but because he is the greatest wizard, he is also the most theatrical wizard. Having Harry succeed in the maze, having Harry overcome these trials, and then in his moment of victory be torn away from the maze, from the third task, all the way to the graveyard here in Little Hangleton to face his death and downfall and ruin. That is the part of Voldemort's plan that makes sense. That is the part of Voldemort's plan that is not given voice, but that is the part that makes the whole complicated Triwizard Tournament structure of this story make a kind of emotional sense, if not a kind of narrative sense. Let me see here. Voldemort keeps downplaying Harry, says Jackie. He only survived because of his mother. He only won the tournament because of my Death Eater. Jackie, that's a really great observation. Yes, he is depriving Harry not just of power and significance, but also of agency. Crucially, of course, that agency is about to be restored to Harry. He is going to force Harry to duel him. But implicit in that restoration of agency to Harry is the understanding that actually Harry has no power. Actually, Harry is just... He's not even the boy who lived, right? He's not even Harry who has spent the last 13 years growing and changing and developing, has spent the last 4 years learning magic at Hogwarts. No, he's still the baby. He is still the impediment rather than... he's the consequence of magic rather than the embodiment of magic. He is not significant. And you'll note the way that Voldemort keeps coming back to this idea, right? And here he is, the boy you all believed had been my downfall. Why is that important? Why is that a significant beat to hit twice over here in 2 consecutive slides? Why is he emphasizing Harry's significance to the Death Eater, significance to the Wizarding World? Because, of course, Voldemort believes that Harry is not significant. Harry is the product of the curse that failed. Harry is not, in any interesting or meaningful way, special. He's accidental. He's some business that needs to be cleared up, right? And of course, at this point in the story, we still don't know why Voldemort is so desperate to kill Harry Potter. Anyway, stick around for more information on that. So this is our plot. The theatricality of it is absolutely necessary if you are, or let me rephrase that. Accepting and buying and enjoying the theatricality of Voldemort's plot is absolutely necessary if one is going to accept and be compelled by the structure of the story overall. Is it trivial to look at this and say, wait, though, what? Yes, it absolutely is. Hey, Voldemort, you could have come up with a better plan. You could have come up with, 55,000 better plans that didn't involve Harry being at the focus of everyone's attention at Hogwarts and attracting even more attention from Dumbledore. Hey, you know what else is happening while the Triwizard Tournament is going on and Fleur and Victor and Cedric are actually competing? Albus Dumbledore's attention is split. He's necessarily paying attention to the Triwizard Tournament. That could have created other means for you to get to Harry. And yes, if you can enchant an object into a portkey, why can't you enchant any object into a portkey? Could have been trivial. Go and open his mail and enchant his giant Easter confection bundle that is sent by Molly Weasley into a portkey. That could have done the trick too. But if you accept Voldemort's desire for theatricality, he wants Harry to succeed, not because there's anything special about Harry, but rather because that delta between triumph and destruction is so great, is so sweet to Voldemort. That manifest cruelty of Voldemort in that disparity of experience, if there is joy and fierce dark hunger from Voldemort for that, then I think it all makes a lot more sense. Yeah. All right. Good. The chat is coming along very nicely. This is Marshall says, if adult Voldy is any indicator, young Tom Riddle must have been insufferable to go to Hogwarts with. Yeah, I think that's right. And Sarah saying, Voldemort's theatricality is why I actually find Umbridge the better written villain. Yes. Okay. If we want to talk about the inversion of that expectation of theatricality, stick around, you guys. We're going to have plenty of opportunity to talk about Dolores Umbridge. Yes, good. This is interesting. Recyclops saying, Voldemort can't just kill Harry. He has to kill the story of Harry in the public imagination. That's an interesting assertion, Recyclops. I can see where you're coming from there, but my instinct would actually be the opposite. I think that actually making a martyr out of Harry would be great for Voldemort because it would only serve to, hey, I killed the boy who lived. You know Harry's one defining characteristic that he's still alive? Not so much anymore. Not so much, actually. I feel as though that would be a major propaganda blow against Voldemort's enemies. He would have robbed them of a great symbol of hope around which they might rally. Are they going to rally around dead Harry in the way that some people might rally around the figure of dead Cedric Diggory? Maybe. But I also think that it would be, I also think that it would play into that notion of theatricality, I suppose, for Voldemort. For me, the more compelling argument is about Harry rather than about the rest of the Wizarding World. I'm not sure that Voldemort cares that much about the rest of the Wizarding World, and certainly their perception of him. It's not as though their perception of him is in any way ambiguous at this point, right? 13 years later, and people still refuse to speak his name. That's how influential he is, yeah. Oh, interesting. Yes. Marshall's kind of developing that thought. How much more powerful and ominous is it for Voldemort if Harry Potter simply disappears from the public perception right before the Dark Lord's triumphant return? Yeah. Yeah, you know what? Let's continue to look at this, and certainly let's continue to look at this in the context of the next book, because we'll see the way that Voldemort actually goes about the... minor spoilers for the next book, you guys. We're not done with Voldemort at the end of Goblet of Fire. But we'll see the ways in which his new tyranny rises, and we can speculate about how that would have played out differently had he been successful at this point. Okay, gosh, I'm already half after time. Let's keep moving. We need to finish up this chapter. It was pain beyond anything Harry had ever experienced. His very bones were on fire. His head was surely splitting along his scar. His eyes were rolling madly in his head. He wanted it to end, to black out, to die. And then it was gone. He was hanging limply in the ropes binding him to the headstone of Voldemort's father, looking up into those bright red eyes through a kind of mist. The night was ringing with the sound of the Death Eater's laughter.
You see, I think, how foolish it was to suppose that this boy could ever have been stronger than me, said Voldemort. But I want there to be no mistake in anybody's mind. Harry Potter escaped me by a lucky chance, and now I am going to prove my power by killing him, here and now in front of you all, when there is no Dumbledore to help him and no mother to die for him. I will give him his chance. He will be allowed to fight, and you will be left in no doubt which of us is the stronger. Just a little longer, Nagini, he whispered, and the snake glided away through the grass to where the Death Eater stood watching. Now untie him, Wormtail, and give him back his wand.
Again, the destruction of Harry Potter and the dominance of Voldemort is very important to him at this point. He is clearly of the belief that some of his Death Eaters have been swayed by the stories surrounding Harry Potter, that some of his Death Eaters are starting to wonder, you remember when you got your butt kicked by that baby? Remember when the baby took you down? Remember that whole thing? Are you sure you're still awesome? That doesn't seem to be true in this sequence. It doesn't seem to be true of the Death Eaters themselves, right? When we have that scene, the reemergence of the Dark Mark scene between Karkaroff and Snape earlier, it's not as though Karkaroff comes in and says, Snape, everything is happening again. The Dark Mark is returning, but you know Voldemort got his ass kicked by a baby, so I'm not that worried about it. Like, doesn't seem to be the public perception literally at all from literally anyone, right? No one is saying Voldemort, yeah, he's just nothing to really worry about at this point. He has, if anything, grown more dangerous and has grown to be a figure of ever greater fear and ever greater darkness in the years since the Wizarding War. His legend now, to the point that we do not speak his name, his legend now is, if anything, more powerful than his actual presence during the First Wizarding War. But that doesn't matter, because it's not the Death Eater's perception that we're worried about here or that we're focused on here. It's Voldemort's perception. He is concerned that this is the case. He has the chip on his shoulder about the boy who lived. This is for him. It will absolutely prove his dominance, and the play acting of giving Harry back his wand, giving this 14-year-old boy back his wand so that he can stand against Voldemort, the greatest wizard of his age. I mean, come on now. This is performative in the most rank and self-serving fashion, but it is also completely true of Voldemort. It is also a fundamental part of that Voldemort characterization that we've had to date. Yes. Voldemort is very insecure, isn't he? Says Rohit. Absolutely nailing it. Yes, 100% Voldemort is very insecure. Yes, good. All right, so let's move on into chapter 34, Priori Incantatum, which is not going to be explained to us until the following chapter. So we'll talk about it when it happens, I suppose. But the title of this chapter is going to be a little bit ambiguous until we get that big recap podcast from Dumbledore after the fact.
You have been taught how to duel, Harry Potter,
said Voldemort softly, his red eyes glinting through the darkness. At these words, Harry remembered, as though from a former life, the dueling club at Hogwarts he had attended briefly 2 years ago. All he had learned there was the disarming spell, Expelliarmus. And what use would it be to deprive Voldemort of his wand, even if he could, when he was surrounded by Death Eaters, outnumbered by at least 30 to 1? He had never learned anything that could possibly fit him for this. He knew he was facing the thing against which Moody had always warned, the unblockable Avada Kedavra curse. And Voldemort was right. His mother was not here to die for him this time. He was quite unprotected.
We bow to each other, Harry,
said Voldemort, bending a little but keeping his snake-like face upturned to Harry.
Come. The niceties must be observed. Dumbledore would like you to show manners. Bow to death, Harry.
The Death Eaters were laughing again. Voldemort's lipless mouth was smiling. Harry did not bow. He was not going to let Voldemort play with him before killing him. He was not going to give him that satisfaction.
I said, bow,
Voldemort said, raising his wand, and Harry felt his spine curve as though a huge invisible hand were bending him ruthlessly forward, and the Death Eaters laughed harder than ever.
Very good,
said Voldemort softly, and as he raised his wand, the pressure bearing down on Harry lifted too.
And now you face me like a man, straight-backed and proud the way your father died. And now we duel.
Straight-backed and proud the way your father died is such a great bit of dialogue, because everything about that and everything about this classic villain monologue structure that we're getting from Voldemort at this point, everything about this Blofeld kind of monologue that we get from Voldemort, everything about this inclines us to believe that the last word in that sentence is going to be did, right? And now you face me like a man, straight-backed and powerful, the way your father did. Look, hey, remember what happened to your father? Remember that whole story? Remember how I killed him very easily indeed? Well, now here you are replicating the image of your father. But no, Voldemort is even more cruel than that, even more literal, I suppose, than that. And now you face me like a man, straight-backed and proud the way your father died. That vowel sound pivot there, that's genuinely great writing. That's always stood out to me as a wonderful example of what J.K. Rowling, arguably in this part of the book, does best. And it's a good thing that she does it best, because boy, howdy, we get a lot of it. But a lot of this attributed dialogue to Voldemort is just lovely, just extraordinarily powerful. You have been taught how to duel, Harry Potter. Voldemort leading Harry here, not quite into the adult world, and even if he led him into the adult world, the two would not be facing each other as equals. The bowing, the observance of standard courtesy here before a duel, this is Voldemort playing with Harry, as Harry clearly recognizes here, right? Harry did not bow. He was not going to let Voldemort play with him before killing him. He was not going to give him that satisfaction. He's recognizing that he is being mocked here, and it's not just the mockery of an adult to a child, and it's not just the mockery of an ancient evil against, his foe. It's not just that. It is also the ironic superiority of Voldemort. You remember we talked about the class distinctions associated with Voldemort in last week's reading. This, to me, is another example of that. He is playing at courtesy with a boy who isn't courteous, a boy who was not well raised, a boy who doesn't know how to behave in fine company and polite society. He is mocking Harry on a number of levels here, as well as yes, creating this stage show for the benefit of the Death Eaters, right? He's, with every turn here, seeking the Death Eaters' approval. Not, I think, because he is insecure in their approval, or not chiefly because he is insecure in their approval, but because he is insecure in himself. He wants this domination. It cannot just be, and now I am going to kill Harry Potter. Avada Kedavra. There you go. Did it. Let's, time for tea probably before the domination of the Wizarding World. It's not that. He's not taking that approach. He wants the performance, and he wants Harry to stand against him so that Harry can be broken. This, as I say, does not seem to be necessary for the Death Eaters. No one is questioning Voldemort's superiority in this regard. Harry, least of all, is questioning Voldemort's superiority in this regard, but Voldemort wants it. He wants this final dominating victory. So we get the useful recap here too. Harry was in the dueling club for 5 minutes 2 years ago, only ever learned Expelliarmus. That was the only spell that he learned. And even if he knew more, even if he could leverage his skill as a wizard, as a fourth-year student at Hogwarts now instead of a second-year student at Hogwarts, even if he could leverage that skill, there's nothing that he can do. The Avada Kedavra curse is unblockable, and his mother is nowhere near him to protect him. This is the circumstance in which Harry finds himself. These are the odds that he is facing here. Yeah. Good. Yeah, Spriha saying, even at 14 years old, Harry has the pride and honor to think he was not going to let Voldemort play with him before killing him. You know, we're going to talk about this in just a moment when we talk about Voldemort's application of the Imperious Curse, but this is, if you break down everything that Harry Potter is, this is probably his most important characteristic. It is his most important characteristic personally as a character that we like in the course of the series, but also narratively speaking. Why is Harry exceptional? Because Harry has this innate resistance to domination. He has this innate resistance to authority. Harry fundamentally will not do as he is told. He certainly won't do as he is told just because he is told to do it. And the more explicit that domination, the more Harry fights back against it. This is the most important thing about Harry as a character. And here we see another manifestation of it. Remember earlier when he fought back against the use of the Imperious Curse in the Defense Against the Dark Arts class, when Mad-Eye Moody's trying to get him to jump on the table. And just this willful voice in the back of his head says, no, I'm not going to do it. Here again, we get that kind of idea. It's not presented in the same way, but it does seem to be part of that same impulse. Harry fights back. Let's move on. Speaking of the Imperious Curse, let's get right to it. So Voldemort casts the Cruciatus Curse on Harry again, causing considerable and unquantifiable pain for Harry, and then cancels it.
A little break, said Voldemort, the slit-like nostrils dilating with excitement. A little pause. That hurt, didn't it, Harry? You don't want me to do that again, do you?
Harry didn't answer. He was going to die like Cedric. Those pitiless red eyes were telling him so. He was going to die, and there was nothing he could do about it, but he wasn't going to play along. He wasn't going to obey Voldemort. He wasn't going to beg.
I asked you whether you want me to do that again, said Voldemort softly. Answer me, Imperio!
And Harry felt, for the third time in his life, the sensation that his mind had just been wiped of all thought. Oh, it was bliss not to think. It was as though he were floating, dreaming.
Just answer no. Say no. Just answer no.
I will not, said a stronger voice in the back of his head. I won't answer.
Just answer no. I won't do it. I won't say it. Just answer no. I won't!
And these words burst from Harry's mouth. They echoed through the graveyard, and the dream state was lifted as suddenly as though cold water had been thrown over him. Back rushed the aches that the Cruciatus Curse had left all over his body. Back rushed the realization of where he was and what he was facing. Just like before, Harry has that innate and subconscious response to the domination of his will. Hey, actually, no. Actually, I will not do this thing. Even in this blissful and tranquil state that you have cast me into, I will fight back. I resist the domination of my will with the deepest levels of my being. The most fundamental aspects of my character are a stubborn refusal to go along with it. He was going to die like Cedric. Those pitiless red eyes were telling him so. He was going to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. Then what difference does it make? What difference does it make how we fall? Well, turns out when the falling's all that's left, it matters very much. He wasn't going to play along. He wasn't going to obey Voldemort. He wasn't going to beg. And this cast us back. I want to jump back to that Defense Against the Dark Arts class where we get this dialogue from Alistair Mad-Eye Moody. The Imperious Curse can be fought, but I'll be teaching you how, but it takes real strength of character and not everyone's got it. Better avoid being hit with it if you can. Constant vigilance. So Mad-Eye Moody in that moment says, no, you can fight back against Imperio, but it takes strength of will. It takes something profound within you. And of course, he is impressed with Harry when he's murmuring into Harry's ear. And you'll remember that when we get this account, then he heard Mad-Eye Moody's voice echoing in some distant chamber of his empty brain, jump onto the desk, jump onto the desk. And his voice starts questioning, why though? Another voice had awoken in the back of his brain. Stupid thing to do, really, said the voice, jump onto the desk. No, I don't think I will, thanks, said the other voice a little more firmly. You see the difference here? The insidious suggestion that he ought to jump onto the desk is completely at odds with this utter crushing domination of his will. Jump onto the desk. What harm could it do? And you'll note too that back in the Defense Against the Dark Arts class, that dialogue is explicitly attributed to Mad-Eye Moody's voice. He can hear Moody in his head urging him to jump onto the desk. We don't get that same association here. We get the italicized, suggestive dialogue here. Just answer no, say no, just answer no, just answer no, just answer no. That is clearly intended to be Voldemort's voice, but it's not presented as Voldemort's voice to us. It doesn't even really have the Voldemort speech pattern that we would expect, perhaps, in this moment. And the response is all the more powerful. Why, though? Stupid thing to do, really. No, I don't think I will, thanks. That's Harry's response to the first use of the Imperio curse against him. This is completely different. I will not. I won't answer. I won't do it. I won't say it. I won't. It's a complete rejection. And we can infer, I think, that in part, Moody is being more skillful with the Imperious Curse. If the Imperious Curse rests in the domination of the target's will, that is to say that a strength of will, like if you roll a successful will check, then you're going to resist it and maybe take half damage, right? To borrow D&D parlance for a second, right? If you roll your successful will saving throw, then you're actually going to resist the Imperious Curse. Then it makes sense for the Imperious Curse to work best when it is not a direct assault upon the will. If it is suggestive, if it is insidious. Jump onto the table. Well, why though? Why should I jump onto the table? Mad-Eye Moody's not yelling at Harry. He's not commanding Harry in quite. He's suggesting, and Harry is in a very suggestible state. So he ends up half jumping onto the table. Here, though, it does seem as though Voldemort's intent is to crush Harry's will completely outright. It's enormously powerful. Yeah. Marshall's asking, what level of Patreon pledge do I need for Alistair to DM for me? Man, I love DMing D&D. It's been a minute since I have, I must admit, but yeah, at some point I really do want to do an actual play podcast. I really do want to gather some people around the table here in Oklahoma City and put out an actual play podcast. So stay tuned for that, I suppose. I have been planning a fiasco game with a group of friends for the longest time. We have literally been planning this since Christmas, and all of our plans have fallen through. But someday those plans will come into focus, and we will be able to sit down and play the heist-inflected game Fiasco over the course of an afternoon. And when we do, we'll definitely record that and put that out as a podcast. I think that would be just a ton of fun. I love tabletop role-playing games. Yeah. All right, let's. You're saying, "Holy beans, I would love that." Yeah. No, it's pretty good, you guys. It's pretty good. Okay. So Harry's resistance here leads us into the Priori Incantatum. Let's look at how this manifests itself and then talk a little about what it is. Before Voldemort could stick his snake-like face around the headstone, Harry stood up. He gripped his wand tightly in his hand, thrust it out in front of him, and threw himself around the headstone, facing Voldemort. Voldemort was ready. As Harry shouted, "Expelliarmus!" Voldemort cried, "Avada Kedavra!" A jet of green light issued from Voldemort's wand, just as a jet of red light blasted from Harry's. They met in midair, and suddenly Harry's wand was vibrating as though an electric charge were surging through it. His hand seized up around it. He couldn't have released it if he'd wanted to. And a narrow beam of light connected the two wands, neither red nor green, but bright, deep gold. Harry followed the beam with his astonished gaze, saw that Voldemort's long white fingers, too, were gripping a wand that was shaking and vibrating. And then, nothing could have prepared Harry for this. He felt his feet lift from the ground. He and Voldemort were both being raised into the air, their wands still connected by that thread of shimmering golden light. They glided away from the tombstone of Voldemort's father and then came to rest on a patch of ground that was clear and free of graves. The Death Eaters were shouting. They were asking Voldemort for instructions. They were closing in, reforming the circle around Harry and Voldemort, the snakes slithering at their heels, some of them drawing their wands. The golden thread connecting Harry and Voldemort splintered. Though the wands remained connected, 1,000 more beams arced high over Harry and Voldemort, crisscrossing all around them until they were enclosed in a golden dome-shaped web, a cage of light, beyond which the Death Eaters circled like jackals, their cries strangely muffled now. Becca saying, so these are the three kind of lights. Any significance? The green light, the red light, and the golden light? Yes. I mean, it's super Christmassy. No, that's all that I can imagine. It's just real festive here. I know it's the middle of June, but it's real festive up in the graveyard of Little Hangleton right now. Yes, the green light that we have associated previously with Avada Kedavra, the red light that we have associated with Expelliarmus, right? Those two things seem consistent and constant. But gold is, as Becca points out here, or as Becca suggests here, really interesting. A silvery light would have been much more expected, would have been much more conventional, because the most powerful magics do seem to manifest in a kind of silvery light. Thinking of the Pensive, thinking of Voldemort's Cauldron of Rebirth, thinking of the Patronus Charm, and so on and so forth. Powerful magics are often silvery, but this is gold. And what's most striking about that is that silver light is always cold, and gold light is always warm. This is beautiful. And it's not something that has been associated with Voldemort previously. This is clearly not something that Voldemort is doing. This is something that is happening to both Harry and Voldemort. They are connected in this moment. Look at how we reference them in this moment as this passage continues, right? And then nothing could have prepared Harry for this. He felt his feet lift from the ground. He and Voldemort were both being raised into the air. Their bonds still connected. The Death Eaters were shouting. They were asking Voldemort for instructions. They were closing in, reforming their circle around Harry and Voldemort. The golden thread connecting Harry and Voldemort. The beams arced high over Harry and Voldemort. This is something that they are experiencing together. They are unified in this experience. And the casting of the gold there, I mean, it does speak to a kind of elevated circumstance and position, I suppose, right? Gold, obviously, a token of kingship, a token of authority, a token of exceptionalism in and of itself, whether you're talking about like gold in terms of its monetary value, or you're talking about gold jewelry, crowns, and so forth. You're talking about a golden sword, you're talking about a golden fleece, for example, right? Gold is always exceptional in fairy tale and unless we're actively subverting our expectations there, but gold is almost always representative of something exceptional, and that seems to be true in this moment too. The red and the green and the gold, yeah, I'm not sure that there's a deeper significance past the fact that it is pretty much unprecedented here, though it does interestingly echo the light of the Triwizard Cup. You remember that great moment right before Harry and Cedric agree to seize the cup together, a decision which I'm sure Harry now regrets immensely, by the way. But we have that moment where Cedric is looking at the cup and he turns back to Harry and his face is awash in golden light. And we talked about he's literally the golden boy, like literally the golden boy, literally the Hogwarts champion, standing right there, washed in golden light. And now this golden light is wreathing Harry and Voldemort together. Yeah. Spreha asking, why is Avada Kedavra portrayed as green specifically? Well, I think this is kind of a retcon. I think the reason that Avada Kedavra is green is that the magic used to kill Harry's parents is green. And the reason that the magic used to kill Harry's parents is green, before we've got to the notion of the killing curse specifically, is that green is just an evil color in Harry Potter. It's the color of Slytherin. It's the color, it's just a color that we like to use to indicate the evil and the sinister, which is, again, the kind of classic narrative color theory, too. So I think that Avada Kedavra was kind of transplanted back into a kind of green magic, rather than the curse itself always being represented, if that makes sense, right? The green light came first, as we saw back in Prisoner of Azkaban, and that was followed by the specifics of the Avada Kedavra killing curse. But yeah. Good. Okay, let me see here. Oh, Jacob asking a fantastic and genuinely heartbreaking question. Do you reckon that if he had his time again, Harry would grab the cup first or let Cedric grab it, assuming one of them had to grab it? Boy, I mean, we can only speculate about what would happen if someone had the opportunity to revisit that moment in history, that specific moment in history, and what might happen if circumstances were changed. I'm being a little wry about a subsequent Harry Potter story. Yes, I do. I completely do. I cannot imagine Harry choosing to circumvent this fate, honestly. I cannot imagine. I do think that he would, with the choice to make over again, would seize it. He would say something to Cedric about, this isn't about the cup. I'm not taking it from you. I'm certainly not. He wouldn't respond to Cedric's suggestion that Harry deserves the cup more than him by saying, you're right, I actually do deserve this cup more. He would resolutely get to his feet and do the thing. That's my reading of it, at least. But yeah. Or call for help, send up red sparks and do that whole thing. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Rahid is reminding us that green showed up in Sorcerer's Stone. Actually, before Hagrid arrived, Harry would sometimes remember a lot of green light. You're right. It wasn't introduced in Prisoner. It was all the way back in Chamber of Secrets. You're absolutely in Chamber of Secrets. Good Lord, in Philosopher's Stone / Sorcerer's Stone. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Very good. Look at that. All right. Becca confirming Harry would totally have grabbed the cup. Yeah, I'm thinking so. Okay, let's, where are we now? We're looking at the Priori Incantatum and what this is. So this is the reversal spell. It is going to be referred to as the reversal spell effect because this is not the first time that we have seen this spell used. And I'm going to be completely honest, guys. I spent like an hour thinking about this today. I spent an hour just thinking about the names because, of course, we have seen the reverse spell cast before in the context of this book. After the events of the Quidditch World Cup, Amos Diggory casts it on Harry's wand. But the version of the spell that he used, Priori Incantatum, is reveal the last spell cast by this wand, basically, right? That's what he does back at the Quidditch World Cup. This is Priori Incantatum. I really wanted that to be a forceful and purposeful bit of Latin, and it is possible that it is. My knowledge of Latin is far too meager to be completely sure that I'm not missing some very subtle grammatical point here that is being made. It does just seem to be a greater evolution of the prior incantato. Prior incantato has evolved and turned into Priori Incantatum. But the difference there between the spell and the spell effect is genuinely fascinating. What causes this effect is the resonance in the phoenix feather heartstrings, the phoenix feather cores in the wands, of course. In fact, let's move on and talk about the Phoenix song, and then we can talk a little more clearly here. "Do nothing!" Voldemort shrieked to the Death Eaters, and Harry saw his red eyes wide with astonishment at what was happening, some fighting to break the thread of light still connecting his wand with Harry's. Harry held onto his wand more tightly with both hands, and the golden thread remained unbroken. "Do nothing unless I command you!" Voldemort shouted to the Death Eaters, and then an unearthly and beautiful sound filled the air. It was coming from every thread of the light-spun web vibrating around Harry and Voldemort. It was a sound Harry recognized, though he had only heard it once before in his life. Phoenix song. It was the sound of hope to Harry, the most beautiful and welcome thing he had ever heard in his life. He felt as though the song were inside him instead of just around him. It was the sound he connected with Dumbledore, and it was almost as though a friend were speaking in his ear. "Don't break the connection." "I know," Harry told the music. "I know, I mustn't." But no sooner had he thought it than the thing became much harder to do. His wand began to vibrate more powerfully than ever, and now the beam between him and Voldemort changed too. It was as though large beads of light were sliding up and down the thread connecting the wands. Harry felt his wand give a shudder under his hand as the light beads began to slide slowly and steadily his way. The direction of the beam's movement was now toward him, from Voldemort, and he felt his wand shudder angrily. As the closest bead of light moved nearer to Harry's wand tip, the wood beneath his fingers grew so hot he feared it would burst into flame. The closer that bead moved, the harder Harry's wand vibrated. He was sure his wand would not survive contact with it. It felt as though it was about to shatter under his fingers. He concentrated every last particle of his mind upon forcing the bead back toward Voldemort, his ears full of Phoenix song, his eyes furious, fixed, and slowly, very slowly, the beads quivered to a halt. And then, just as slowly, they began to move the other way, and it was Voldemort's wand that was vibrating extra hard now. Voldemort, who looked astonished, almost fearful. So, Harry and Voldemort's wands are, as Ollivander told us way back in the pages of the Philosopher's Stone, brothers. They are the same wand. They are constructed around phoenix feather cores. In fact, as we're going to find out in the next chapter, they are constructed around the tail feathers of Fawkes the Phoenix, Dumbledore's Phoenix. So it is no surprise that Harry should be hearing Phoenix song now, casting back, of course, to the end of Chamber of Secrets and the eucatastrophic intervention of Fawkes at that point. But this is also a great moment of a kind of bias toward goodness and hope in the world of Harry Potter that we see relatively rarely, honestly. This is a pretty dark world, it turns out, particularly as we move through book 3 into book 4, and goodness knows for the rest of the series too. Harry's world is pretty bleak and is pretty shadowed and pretty austere, actually. And bad things happen all the time. But this is a perfect example of something good emerging from a confluence of circumstances over which Harry has no control whatsoever. Why is Harry capable of beating Voldemort here in this battle of wills, driving the little beads of light down as they are suspended in this lattice of golden light? Why is Harry capable of winning this fight? Well, because the Phoenix song. He can hear the Phoenix song, and it enkindles within him hope and goodness and positivity and that personal connection to Albus Dumbledore. And presumably exactly the same thing is happening to Voldemort, but that is going to be way more deleterious for Voldemort than it is for Harry, because the Phoenix song represents community and loyalty and love, and these things are going to be, well, at the very least, indifferent, right? Best case scenario, Voldemort is not getting the buff from this spell that Harry is getting from this spell, right? He's not getting his +1 on every roll. It's just D&D reference palooza tonight here on Dear Mr. Potter. I do apologize. But he's not getting that +1 buff on every roll from the Bard song that is currently being sung in the background. He's probably getting, at the very least, no effect at all, and more likely some kind of negative penalty to his rolls here. It's always so tempting when we're talking about Harry Potter, particularly in these moments of very high action and elevated magic, I suppose. It's very tempting, particularly because this is episode 55 of Dear Mr. Potter, you guys. We have spent, at the very least 75 hours and probably much closer to 90 hours talking about the Harry Potter series to date. And it is very tempting to delve deep immediately into the minutiae. Well, what is this? What is this Phoenix Force resonance that is happening here between the wands? How is this manifesting itself? Is this something that is in common with all wands? Do all wands of similar provenance have this kind of association? How is this not just a known phenomenon in the wizarding world? How, like, two random Slytherin kids happen to have wands that are coexistent or are resonant in this way, and they just accidentally destroy half of Hogwarts when they try and cast Expelliarmus on each other? Why is this not a thing? It's very tempting to try and break this down. It is very tempting to be analytical in a deconstructive way about it. But what I want to do most importantly through this is look at the prose and celebrate the prose that we get from J.K. Rowling, because this is it's just lovely. The image here of the beads of light moving back and forth, the image of the wand jerking and shaking violently under Harry's grasp, the idea of these expanded beams of light passing around them and above them. This to me is mesmerizing storytelling. I'm absolutely anchored in Harry's experience at this moment, and the turn when it comes digging deep here. He concentrated every last particle of his mind upon forcing the bead back toward Voldemort, his ears full of Phoenix song, his eyes furious and fixed. Those are not three separate thoughts, by the way, right? He concentrated every last particle of his mind upon forcing the bead back toward Voldemort, comma, his ears full of Phoenix song, comma, his eyes furious, comma, fixed. All of these things are contributing to the same effect. Why is Harry victorious here? Well, because he's concentrating every particle of his mind, and because his eyes are focused and fixed, and because he's just staring at Voldemort and not trying to look away, and because his ears are full of Phoenix song. Everything is conspiring here to amplify Harry's abilities, to at the very least clarify Harry's abilities here, so that he can drive the beads of light back. Yeah, I'm looking very anxiously at the clock here. This is tough. Yes, Priya saying I wish we got something similar to this at the end of the 7th book. This is one of my problems with the this is one of my problems with the movie adaptations of the Harry Potter series, I've got to tell you, because we do this all the time. We do the Ghostbusters crossing the streams thing all the time in the movies, which wouldn't be a problem. It's a great magical effect, but it is also a great magical effect that has a very specific meaning within the context of Harry Potter, right? It's not as though that is an unexplored dynamic for wands and wand users in the Harry Potter books. So when we take it to the big screen and we just not entirely replicate this event, of course, but we do something similar with crackling energy from the tips of wands clashing into each other, driving back and forth. That's a great visual metaphor for dueling, by the way. That is interesting. It does kind of stand in opposition to what we understand of dueling and the skillful discipline that's associated with dueling in the books. But the fact that they are basically taking the Priori Incantatum kind of visual effect and using it much more freely through the movies does kind of bother me a little bit, but it is very impressive. As Sarah observes, the movies reduce the spell to a lot of bangs. That is absolutely fair. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I have 5 minutes left in tonight's session, and I do have a hard out, so we're not going to get to Lily. Let's hold here. We will get to the reveal. I've only got 2 slides left of tonight's session, but there's just no way that I can get through it in the last 6 minutes. So instead, what we'll do is we'll call it there. Next week, we will look at the last beat here of Priori Incantatum. Let me just fast forward through the slides that I have. Next week, Veritaserum and the Parting of the Ways. We will finish up this chapter, as I say, 2 more slides, then we'll get through Veritaserum, and we'll get through most of Parting of the Ways. I don't think we're going to get through that entire chapter, but that's okay, because then the following week, we'll finish up the Parting of the Ways and get to the beginning. Next week's session, crucially, is going to be an afternoon session. It has been a while since I've done an afternoon session, and I know that the European audience for Dear Mr. Potter is getting a little bit restless because they can't make it to these late evening live sessions here in the Central Time Zone. So 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central next Tuesday. That is May the 29th, 2018. and then we'll be back to an evening session the following week. So next week, the end of Priori Incantatum, Veritaserum, and the Parting of the Ways. That's the end of chapter 34, chapter 35, and chapter 36, or the first half of chapter 36 next week, and then we will conclude, believe it or not, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire the week after. Let's see if I can delve into the question bucket for just a few minutes here. Let me cancel this slide and come back to you all. Wow, that's a lot of material to cover tonight, but that was a ton of fun. Let's see. Sarah asks, our first question, is Voldemort misogynistic? That was not a question I expected to be asked, Sarah. What a great question. Is Voldemort misogynistic? He says, band of wizards when referring to the Death Eaters. While there are Death Eaters who are not identified as male or female, those who are identified as to sex are male, and when a gendered pronoun is used, it's always male. Bellatrix is the sole exception. As far as I can recall, no other Death Eater has been stated as female. If Voldemort is, I guess, misogynistic, is this reflective of the old ways in society he purports to represent? Sarah, what a beautifully written and entirely astute question. The answer is yes and yes. That's my reading of it anyway. Yes and yes. There is a trenchant kind of misogyny associated with the power structures of the wizarding world. And I wouldn't even necessarily limit this to Voldemort and the Death Eaters, though certainly that is true. For example, look at the way that we talk about Bertha Jorkins. Look at the way that we are going to talk about Dolores Umbridge. Look at the way that we talk about Rita Skeeter. There is a old-fashioned mid-20th century, if not late 19th century, kind of British misogyny at play in the wizarding world. Absolutely, yes. Not, to be careful to distinguish this, at Hogwarts, I would argue. There's never a question that Minerva McGonagall is anything less than utterly respected and treated as an equal by Albus Dumbledore. That is of crucial importance. And in fact, the gender split in the faculty of Hogwarts does seem to be pretty reasonable, does seem to be pretty equitable, as is the split in the student body too, I would argue. But yes, I think if you look at the Ministry of Magic and you look at the way that power structures of which we are supposed to be suspicious treat women, it's not great. It's not great. The way that we talk about Bertha Jorkins in particular in the context of this book, that she's this silly, flighty thing who would forget her head and, oh, she's just off gallivanting in Albania and she's definitely nothing bad has happened to her. She's probably just lost. Huh? You know how these women are. Yeah, I don't love it. Rita Skeeter as the awful, hard-hearted journalistic career woman archetype is pretty gross. Dolores Umbridge as the evil matriarch figure is equally gross and unpleasant. But I want to be clear about this. Purposefully gross and unpleasant. I think that J.K. Rowling is doing this absolutely deliberately because it is not ubiquitous. It is not the case that we just have terrible female figures, terrible female characters throughout this series. Hermione suffers a little bit from being the smart one of the power trio, but hardly ever suffers, I would argue, from being the girl of the power trio. I think that Molly Weasley is a standout character, one of my absolute favorites in fiction. I think that Minerva McGonagall is a standout character, one of my absolute favorites in fiction. And we are just as willing to demonize male characters as we are female characters. But yes, I would suspect, almost to the point of certainty, that Voldemort contains within him a streak of old-fashioned, school tie, mid-20th century British paternalism and misogyny. And I think that is absolutely represented in his relationship with the Death Eaters in general. And also, this is reflective of his upper-class kind of old-school roots, I would argue. This is reflected in his relationship with the Death Eaters in general, and absolutely reflected in his relationship with Bellatrix, who we will meet in the very near future. I would also argue that you can see that specifically in the interactions between Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger. I think that Draco has definitely inherited inherited a misogyny, which I have no trouble also attributing to Lucius Malfoy. Yes, I think that is absolutely endemic to that part of the wizarding world, but I do not think that is accidental, and I do not think that is something we can be critical of J.K. Rowling for. I think that is an intentional criticism of those kinds of communities and those kinds of societies. Yes, that would be my read. As Becca say here, Voldemort is the patriarchy. Smash the patriarchy. Yeah, good. Let me catch up here. Yeah, Recyclops saying, man, even Dumbledore needs to hire someone who isn't white, though. Race and ethnicity, obviously a hot button topic in the context of Harry Potter after the after the recasting of Hermione Granger, the reconceptualization of Hermione Granger. Now, here's the thing. I support J.K. Rowling in her decision to recast Hermione as a black character. I think that is absolutely great. You're right. You know what? There are too few people of color in the Harry Potter universe. Let's be more diverse. Fantastic. I don't love J.K. Rowling's accounting of that. Things that are canonical about Hermione Granger, braces, curly hair, very smart, etc. At no point do we mention skin color. No, J.K., that's true. But you do definitely mention the skin color of every black character who goes to Hogwarts. Thus, by omission, we can be pretty damn sure that, you know, Hermione is not black, that Hermione is, in fact, very white and kind of stereotypically Britishly middle class. Yeah, I support colorblind casting. I support genderblind casting. I think that the best characterization, I'm not even necessarily talking about performance here, not necessarily talking about acting here, but I genuinely believe that the best characterization for any given character can come from anywhere. Authenticity is nothing like as simple as the tribal identifiers with which we cloak ourselves, with which we define ourselves. Authenticity of experience is so much more nebulous and so much more complicated and so much more beautiful and fragile and brilliant than that. I don't think that we need to be held back or held down by that, I have to admit. Let me see as I catch up now that I'm doing a little distracted soapbox standing here. All right, that I think is going to do it. In fact, that is going to do it because we are at time. Sarah, thank you so much for a genuinely fascinating question. Let me see. Spreeha asks, were all the Death Eaters in Slytherin house, or do you think they could come from other houses too? We've discussed dark wizards of other houses. We know that there are dark wizards of other houses. Slytherin has produced more dark wizards than any other house, is the account that we get. I have no trouble believing that... Well, okay, the Death Eaters specifically, I would expect to come from Slytherin, primarily because their defining characteristic is their ambition and their power-hungry ruthlessness. That seems to be pretty consistent in the Death Eaters for me, so I would expect that they are all Slytherin. Are all Dark Wizards or all sympathizers of Voldemort's movement from Slytherin? No, almost certainly not. If I had to guess, and I'm sure this is over on Pottermore somewhere, I don't know for sure, but if I had to guess, based on his behavior in the Inquisition after the First Wizarding War, I might guess that Bartemius Crouch was Gryffindor. I might guess that Ludo Bagman is Hufflepuff. I think we might be able to see very easily a sportsmanlike characteristic to Ludo Bagman that is not a million miles away from Cedric Diggory, right? I think that wizards are going to fall into darkness, either lowercase d or uppercase d, in different ways according to their natural predispositions and inclinations, and I think that we're going to see that of wizards from every house. That really does have to do it, though. You guys, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I will see you all next Tuesday afternoon. That is 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central on Tuesday, May the 29th, for episode 56 of Dear Mr. Potter, in which we discuss the end of Priori Incantatum, into Veritaserum, into the parting of the ways. We've got a lot to discuss as we wrap up the book in the next 2 weeks, and then we move on to the movie, which is going to be a ton of fun to discuss. Guys, thank you all so much for joining me. I hope you all have a fantastic week. I shall see you all next Tuesday. Until then, mischief managed. Good night, all.